Okay. Well, thank you for having me. Good evening, New Jersey beekeepers. And I'm going to talk to you about some research that one of my graduate students, and actually a couple of my different graduate students, have contributed to. And I'm going to tell you a tale of a few flower visitors. So let's just hop right on in. And I'm talking to beekeepers here, so you know what I mean by pollination. And this picture should be somewhat obvious that it's honeybees placed in an orchard. And as beekeepers, I think a lot of us, when we think of pollination, this is a picture that may come to our minds. And, thinking about these particular beauties, visiting flowers and moving pollen. And I think as beekeepers, we really focus on this idea of honeybees as pollinators. But I know a lot of us also know that that's not just the only bee visiting these different flowers, and that different types of flowers depend upon different types of bees, and different bees can move pollen more efficiently than others. Excuse me. But because of our agricultural system, we really have relied on the commercialization of honeybees, basically the ability of us to have large numbers of colonies and move them into big monocultures. And so therefore, honeybees have become our poster insect for pollination for good reason. And, one thing that we weren't anticipating is that we as beekeepers would have to deal with a lot of honeybee loss. And I would say probably since 2006, colony failures between 40 to 50% have become far too common. And so much research has focused on what is causing these declines, what's causing colonies not to make it through the winter. And I think we also know that there's a number of different things that are, causing these problems with honeybee survivability. And when we get back to this idea of pollination and this movement of the male pollen grain, which you actually can see here, these are pollen grains attached to a stigmatic surface, so the female reproductive part of a flower. And it's not just honeybees that are excellent at moving these pollen grains to the stigma. And this really is a picture showing the definition of pollination, which I think is pretty awesome. And there's a lot of other bees that are capable of doing this and doing a really, really good job of it. And I think because of honeybee losses, a lot of research shifted and focus is now more on other types of pollinators, not just bees, but also even things like flies, like syrphid flies or hover flies, which many of them actually look like bees. We call them bee mimics, or even some different types of Lepidoptera, butterflies, adult Lepidoptera. So there's a lot of different things that visit flowers, get pollen attached to them, and then as they visit another flower, actually transfer that pollen. Now, native bees are extremely adorable, and I'm going to show you a lot of really sweet looking bees. And native bees pollinate our native plants. And a lot of people, ask me, have honeybees displaced native bees? And, we really can't answer that question because honeybees were brought to the Americas as early as records show, possibly the 1500s. So there was no research kind of showing before and after to really kind of get at that question. But I do think a lot of people believe that honeybees do displace our native bees. But one thing in support of the fact that native bees are doing this fine is that we have done surveys of native bees in different areas, and we find thriving populations and a pretty large diversity of native bees. If we also kind of understand this idea of niche, this niche is the functional role of an organism, and no two species can share a niche. And one thing about native bees is that they don't require as large of a patch as a honeybee. A honeybee colony has thousands of inhabitants, right? And so they have a much higher food requirement than, say, a native bee, which many of them are solitary. So a lot of our native plants aren't going to be as appealing to honeybees in terms of providing food compared to those small patches being really, really appropriate and perfect for our native bees and our native pollinators. So here's a picture of, and I've probably showed this before to some of you in this group. I use this picture a lot because I think it's so fascinating. And this is a tree that has been covered to protect these bumblebees from foraging on the blossoms, because the blossoms actually were poisoning the honeybee or the bumblebees. And so one thing, anything that feeds on nectar and pollen is also going to suffer some problems, some of the same problems as our honeybee populations. Yes, we have pests and pathogens that are unique to honeybees, but some of the problems that our honeybees face also our native bees face as well. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of those. The first bee listed under, oops, hold on. I just wanted to move this little thing. There we go. Go back. Under the Endangered Species Act in the continental U.S. is the rusty patch bumblebee. This is Bombus affinis, and you can see it has this little rusty patch on its abdomen, and that's how it got its name. This used to be an extremely common species, especially in the Mid-Atlantic. And now there's very, 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 very few populations, and they are dwindling even still. So we can see how there's been a change in the diversity of the bee landscape over these past couple decades. And this really has to do with the fact that if we focus on number 2 here, intensified land use. Yes, pests and pathogens are the problem. Yes, there's been changes in our climate and our weather. Yes, a lot of our bees, especially commercial bees, undergo a lot of stress in different situations, from being put on semi-trucks and moved for pollination across the country, and also just kept in less ideal situations. But number 2 is what I'm really going to focus on here when I talk about the few little bees that I'm going to talk about. And not just the intensified land use, so this changing of a more diverse landscape to one of less diversity and of more monocultures of particular crops that might not necessarily be native to the Americas, but also the loss of just nutritious forage overall to support these native pollinators. So we kind of know this. This is our gospel when we're talking about the importance of honeybees, that 90% of flowering plants rely on pollination by animals. And I love this. 200,000 species of animals provide pollination, and guess what? 199,000 of them are insects. So people who you don't like insects, then you can just stuff it, as far as I'm concerned. And bees enable reproduction in about 94% of flowering plants. You can't disagree with these statistics, and realizing that insects, and bees especially, really support us and our livelihood in terms of providing food. So who are the pollinators? You can see I have a bunch of different pictures here, and these are just the bee pollinators, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. And we're going to talk about a few of these, not all of these that are pictured here. This is here Peponapis pruinosa, the squash bee, but we are going to be talking a little bit about megacylids. These are leaf cutters. We're going to be talking a little bit about mining bees. These are andrenids. A little bit about blue orchard bees. These are osmia, also leaf cutters, and also Hlictids and Carpenter bees. Not so much about bumblebees today. So where can we find these native bees? And when we're dealing with native bees, they're not conspicuous, right? They're tiny. Many of them nest in the ground. Some of them nest in wood or pre-made cavities. So these are not going to be conspicuous in terms of finding their nest. But you will find them where there's suitable forage and suitable nesting substrate. And if you know about their phenology when they occur on the landscape, then you can go out hunting for them. And this is Andreina aeruginiae, and this is a specialist mining bee that focuses on spring beauty. It collects pollen from spring beauty, and we'll talk a lot about this particular species today, or actually both of these species today. Now, native bees have all sorts of different types of nesting substrate. This might be something that's familiar to you. You can actually purchase houses for native bees, and really the size of the cavity, these are pre-made cavities up here, determines what species is going to utilize that space. And only certain species or certain families actually use pre-drilled cavities. We'll talk about it as well. You can also provide them with tubes from reeds to bamboo, all different types of structures. Again, the diameter of these hollow straws or tubes is going to determine what species is able to utilize it. Now, there's some bees that actually take materials and construct a nest of their own. This is an osmia from, I think it's Iran or Turkey, I can't remember which one, that actually clips pieces of flower petals and glues them together to make this structure. And so this is not a flower. This is actually pieces of flower petals that have been glued together, and that is what they're going to lay their eggs and make their next generation from. So this is a different type of leaf cutter that focuses not on cutting leaf pieces, but on flower pieces. Now, ones that don't use pre-existing structures or cavities, ones that don't necessarily line their nest or make their nests out of other material, you can find nesting in the ground. And we call these ground nesting bees. We can also refer to them as mining bees. And you can see one peeking its head out here. The family name is Andreina, and the genus that is most common and what I'm going to talk about is the genus Andreina. And I'm showing you these kind of squiggly drawings. These are line drawings of the different nest structures underground. So they've been able to extrapolate what these look like by pouring plaster down these holes and being able to then dig around and pull up these kind of very intricate tunnelings underground. Each one of these kind of bulbous portions of this tunnel will contain a pollen clump as well as an egg will be laid on it. So each one will harbor a developing larvae that will soon become the next season an adult that will start the cycle over again. And you can actually distinguish species by the morphology of the nest, which is pretty cool. So this would be kind of a very simplified version of what this looks like. You can see the mound of soil, and she would kind of go down and she would lay her eggs on the pollen clumps that she's collected in each one of these little tunnels. And like I said before, these are small bees. They're solitary. And what I mean by solitary is that they are not social. It is a single mom working for her next generation who she's never even going to meet. She will be long passed away before her daughters and sons emerge the following season. So this isn't something this picture is very difficult to get. Because this is not really easy to find, these little small solitary mining bees. So the habitat I'm going to focus on here is one that we don't normally associate with the idea of bees, and these are forests. And forests are important bee habitat. And what I mean by bee habitat and what I'm talking about in terms of native solitary bees is the fact that this provides a lot of great different types of nesting substrate for a lot of these solitary bees. Also, this is where before the canopy closes, you're going to have a lot of different spring ephemeral flowers. So what we see with a lot of these solitary bees, these native bees, is that they are more specific or specifically tied to native flora. And that's because they've been able to evolve with this flora over time and best figure out and adapt to how to utilize it. Of course, once the canopy closes and these beautiful trees start to flower, if they are indeed deciduous, like tulip poplar or black locust, then boy, oh boy, is it a fantastic foraging resource for honeybees who need that big canopy of flowers to support their colonies. But we're talking about before canopy closure and what utilizes the spring ephemeral flowers in these forest habitats. So bees, like I said, are only active until canopy closure, and that's native bees specifically. And we know very little about forest bee communities. And really, we live in a very fragmented forest area here in the Mid-Atlantic. We even have small little forest fragments in clover leaves off of 95. If you've ever kind of gone on an off or an on ramp of 95, you'll kind of see this little patch of forest. And those are some of the fragments that we've been able to look at to see, can they support native bees? And what do the forest bees in these communities look like? We've also been able to look at much larger forest fragments too, and to be able to compare the two. And we were able to do this because we had the most awesome team of citizen scientists helping us. This is something that we could not have done alone. And so we enlisted the help of a dedicated team of people. We gave them a protocol, we gave them the supplies, and they were awesome. They did not disappoint. You can see all their smiling faces. And these red spots actually represent all of the different citizen scientists and where they collected bees to help us get an initial survey of native bees in different forest fragments. So you can see that it covers Maryland, it covers parts of Delaware, and so it covers a wide swath, even into the suburbs and areas in DC. So when we kind of started to look at these woodland bees and see who or what was the diversity in these forest fragments or these woodlands, we collected 12,510 bees, 21 genera, so they spanned 21 different genera, and 148 species. And I'm just going to present to you a few of the big standouts in terms of high numbers. And this is by genus. Okay, so within each of these different bees that you're seeing here, these are genuses or genera. There's numbers of species, right? So we have nomada. These are the cuckoo bees, and there's a bunch of different species of cuckoo bees, very difficult to identify. But we caught about 15% of that 12,000 whatnot number were nomada. We also found mason bees or osmia, about 14%. These are going to be in megachilid family. And then we also found about 51%. So the big bulk of the bees that we found in these woodland environments were mining bees in the family Andreinidae and the genus Andreina. And then finally, Hlictid. These are the sweat bees, and about Lasioglossum, which is the genus, about 10%. And Sam Drogi was a part of this project, and so this is why we have these beautiful pictures from him. And one thing that I want you to see, you can see some of this work was done in 2014 and 2015, but it was also done in 2013 and 2016. But you can see here the phenology. And what I mean by forest bee phenology, and what I want you to pay attention to, is this is mean abundance per site, and this is based on different sexes. So you can see in the blue line are males, and the green line are females. And then also what you can see here is that we have March going from week 1 to about week 3. Week 4, we have April, and we can say week 8 is a good indicator of around May. And the thing that I want you to see is that these bees they are predominantly around, active as adults, provisioning their young for the next season in April and early May. This is the big kind of bolt, this early spring bolt, and this is before canopy closure. Also, an interesting thing to note here is that the males actually usually emerge first. And that's because they emerge, they start to feed, and then that gives them time for the females to come out and then for them to locate a female and mate. So remember, this first week meaning March, this fourth week meaning April, and this eighth week meaning May as we look at these following charts. And we're going to first talk about Andreina. And you can see out of those 12,000 whatnot specimens, 2,641 were Andreina carlini, and about 1,000 were Andreina perplexa. So mining bees really dominated our collection. And if we kind of look at the phenology of these and remember the weeks that I was telling you about, you can see up here, this is carlini, and this is perplexa. So up top is one species, and on the bottom is a different species. We have in this first kind of row here, 2014 and 2015 for the same species. And what's really interesting is not only for carlini do we see that they are more active in kind of weeks 2 through 4, meaning April is really kind of the sweet spot for when you see the peak abundance of Andreina carlini, not only in 2014, but also pretty consistently in 2015. Down here with Andreina perplexa, we see that the sweet spot really is the end of April and the beginning of May. So again, thinking about niche, kind of the functional role and how two species can't occupy the same niche, we see here there's kind of this timing difference in terms of their peak abundance so that they can utilize the forests differently. So out of all of the bees that we collected in these woodland environments, we found that 64% of the species were solitary. There are some native bee species that are some level of social. So they might be communal or subsocial. There's all these different kind of caveats, which we're not going to go in the weeds there today. But if you look at this, this is a graph based off the data. This is what we caught mean abundance of eusocial insects, which were mostly honeybees and some bumblebees. These were parasitic, which I'll get to in a little bit, the nomada, the cuckoo bees. And then we have our solitary bees here. And this life cycle here shows a female bee lays an egg on pollen and nectar ball. The larvae will feed on that pollen and nectar ball, and then it'll merge the following season. So this is kind of the life cycle of a solitary bee. They're never going to meet their mom. Right? And also what's really interesting is this pollen nectar ball, just like we have bee bread in a honeybee colony, this pollen nectar ball, as it is sitting there, starts to ferment and change into a bee bread-like substance for this developing larva. So I talked about parasites, and we're going to distinguish actually even further a different kind of caveat of parasites, and we're going to talk about kleptoparasites. And about 16% of the species we found were kleptoparasites. And we'll talk a little bit about what kleptoparasites are. And here is a picture of a beautiful cuckoo bee. This is the genus Nomada. And like I said, these are difficult to identify. And for those of you who don't know, cuckoo bees actually rob or are thefts of resources of other bees. And so it's really interesting. Again, these are solitary bees, but the female will wait in front of a mining bee nest hole. They will locate a mining bee, specifically Andreina, right? And they will wait and kind of wait to see when she's going to come out. And then the mama will go into the nest hole of the Andreina, and it will actually lay its egg in one of the chambers where that pollen ball and the larvae were put by the Andreina mama. And then when that nomada larva comes out of the egg, it actually has strong mandibles as a larva, and it will actually eat the pollen ball and also destroy the larva, and it will develop inside that nest protected. So it's robbing the Andreina of the resources that it's provisioning for its young, and it's taking those resources and making it for their young. Cuckoo bees do not collect any nectar. They don't collect any pollen. They specifically utilize the resources, mostly of other native solitary bees, Andreina being a big, big one in terms of the genus that they focus on. It's really interesting. And a lot of studies have looked at how these cuckoo bees can actually get into these nests without being detected. And it's thought that they actually contain different chemical compounds on their bodies that mimic those of their host bee. So really complex and intricate relationship between these two native solitary bee species. Here is another picture of a nomada, kind of looking at these different nest entrance holes, kind of scanning to see when it's going to go in. All right, so now if we look at substrate in these woodland areas, we found that most of the bees that we collected actually nest in the soil. So 78% of the bee species we collected in these woodland forest fragments were soil nesters. And I find this so fascinating because most of the research and most of the time when I think about bees and the research I've read, it focuses on bees on flowers or bees outside of the nest, when probably about 80 to 90% of these soil nesting bees spend 80 to 90% of their life underground. And we know so very little about that nest condition or nest microclimate. So you can see here in the nesting substrate, we have cavity nesters, we have hives, right? So the honeybees, we have pith nesters, which I'll talk a little bit about. But you can see that the majority of these forest bees nest in the soil. So again, this is another picture showing you kind of what this underground nest looks like. And this is actually a picture of a Melisodes. And you can see the larvae feeding on this pollen ball. And another kind of interesting fact about these solitary bees, they give them this giant pollen ball. And so they're mass provisioning for their young, because once they get the pollen ball big enough, they lay the egg, they're never going to see it again. So they have to make sure that they provide enough pollen nectar ball that will get that particular larvae or egg, once it hatches, through to an adult. All right, so here is a picture of a Hlictid. This is a Hlictids can also nest in the ground, certain species, but certain species nest in the wood, and you can see it nesting here in this kind of decaying log. So the wood nesting bees that we located were Agochlora pura and also Lasioglossum corioleum. And these are two different Hlictids. You can see they look very different in terms of their morphology, and they're both very beautiful. And you know, they're very interesting species for sure. Now, if we think about cavity nesting bees, we really focus mainly on megachilid. So these are our leaf cutters. So they're going to be using pre-existing holes. Another one that can utilize pre-existing holes are also carpenter bees. So we'll also talk a little bit about them. But here are cavity nesting bees. This is a cross-section of a tunnel. And you can see the pollen clump with the egg laid on it right there. And so if you were to do a cross section into one of your reeds, if you have one of these nests, or into kind of a piece of wood that has pre-drilled holes, this is hopefully what you would see, is this pollen clump as well as this egg. Now, a lot of these different cavity nesting bees line these pre-existing holes with different types of materials, from leaf material to mud, all sorts of different materials depending on the bee species. So we have our mason bees, you can see here, and this is in the genus Osmia. And a lot of people provide structures for these mason bees. Mason bees are known to be wonderful pollinators of different types of tree fruits, and are, you know, people have been trying to figure out how to increase Osmia populations in orchard settings. We also have small carpenter bees. These are in the same family as our regular larger carpenter bees, but they are a different genus called Seratina, and they are adorable and tiny. You can see it here. It also has kind of a bluish blackish hue. And if we look in terms of foraging behavior at all of the forest bees that we collected, we also find that most of the bees are pollen generalists. And why do we care? Well, this really gets at to whether a bee is specializing on one particular type of plant or species of plant or family of plants, or if they can actually utilize a bunch of different floral resources. And this gets into understanding conservation and management. So if we see that we have certain species that absolutely require and can only utilize one type of flower or type of flowering plant group, then we can start making conservation efforts to make sure that that type of flower is around. Also, we can also see that most of the bees that we collected were generalists, meaning they were polylectic and could actually utilize multiple different types of pollen sources. This is one of my favorites. This is Andreina airginiae, and it is on a spring beauty. And it is just like a little fairy. I mean, look at that baby pink pollen. It is, it just warms my heart. And this is one of our oligolectic foragers. So this is a specialist on spring beauty. And so this is a very special, beautiful relationship that has evolved over centuries between this flower and this bee. All right, so of the forest bees that we collected, we also collected some exotics. And so these are ones that have been introduced to this area, some intentionally, some not intentionally. You've probably heard of some of them. Our native orchard bee is Osmia lignaria, and we caught 10 of those out of that 12,000. If you look at the other Osmia, Osmia taurus and Osmia cornifrons, which are not native to our area, you can see much higher numbers of these exotic species, which is a little alarming, honestly. And there's actually, we published a paper with some colleagues, Katie LaCroix, basically showing that these exotic species are kind of out-competing our native species. So I'm now going to switch, now that we kind of know who our forest bees are. I think a lot of times as beekeepers, and I know this is the focus for me, is I focus on what can I plant for my honeybees? What type of apiary setting do I want to put my bees in so I know that I'm supplying them with quality and quantity in terms of pollen resources as well as nectar resources. And now I want to kind of shift our focus to what predicts native bee presence, because it's going to be different for native bees. And that's because they have different types of nesting substrates, which I've just talked about, and their floral resources are going to be different than what honeybees utilize. So what predicts native bee presence? Flower type and availability, especially the availability in terms of if it's synchronized with that early emergence time of some of these native bee species, as well as special nesting substrate availability. So we've talked about before, how do we provide nutritious forage sources for our pollinators and nesting substrates? Well, we need to plant flowers. We need to protect and provide habitat. We need to understand what that habitat is that we need to protect. And now I hope I've convinced you that these forest fragments are important habitat. They help to support many, many different species of native bees. And just like our honeybees, just like our many other insects, um, these native bees need pollen and nectar. They need and they actually require both of these things in order to make a future generation. And we know that pollen has all of these wonderful, wonderful things in it. But really, when we think about pollen, we're thinking protein, we're thinking amino acids, vitamins, minerals, and lipids and fats, right? And so pollen is that kind of, oh, it's just the good stuff that helps a developing insect go through instar to instar or larval stage to larval stage until it becomes a nice, healthy, fat adult. Whereas our nectar is providing sugar, it's providing all of the energy demands of that insect, fueling the cells, fueling the flight muscles, fueling the development of glands, and all of the things that make that insect work. And carbs are required by not just immatures, but also adults. And we think about kind of social species. We know that they are so important for thermoregulation of the nest and the cavity. But if we think about native bees, they're extremely important for the developing larvae, but also for fueling the solitary mom so that she can go from flower to flower. She's not only collecting for her young, but she's also drinking nectar in order to keep flying, to keep collecting nectar and pollen for her young. Here's a picture of a bunch of different nectaries, and many of these, this is tulip poplar. This would be one that our honeybees definitely frequent. There's also plants that actually have extra floral nectaries, so other places besides the flower that produces sweet, sweet nectar. So nectaries come in many sizes, shapes, and in different locations on different plants. So important variables is going in terms of what's going to entice our native bees are the same that are going to be the same that we see with honeybees, and that's concentration. So how sweet the nectar is, so how much sugar's in it, and also volume, just the overall amount of nectar a particular flower produces. In terms of pollen, protein is extremely important. Basically, an insect will not go from one instar to another or from one developmental stage to another without protein. And the protein is coming from the pollen. So, pollen is absolutely essential for growth and development of insects. It's what makes more insects, especially ones that require pollen for development, like our flower visitors. Pollen is extremely protected. It is a expensive gamete for a plant to make. It's the male gamete. And so this protected kind of protein ball is something that is hardy and able to be protected from outside elements, but bees have evolved a way to actually break down that exterior hard portion of the pollen ball in order to utilize nutrients and actually to change some of the constituents of that pollen grain into different vitamins and minerals through help of microbes. So pollen is larval food. It is absolutely essential for the optimum growth of young and adult honeybees as well as native bees. It also is the main source of the buildup of fat reserves in the fat bodies of honeybees, but also in the fat reserves of native bees as well, which we know that these fat reserves in honeybees and native bees and many insects that have these fat bodies actually also have an important role in immune function. So all of this is tied together. So I wanted to talk to you about a little bit of work that I've done with Mount Cuba Center, which is a native plant research center near me. It's actually not too far from Longwood Gardens and kind of associated with Longwood Gardens, but Mount Cuba focuses on native plants. And we worked with them to determine the ecological role of flowering plants. So many people ask us, what should we plant if we want to increase diversity of bees in our yard? And they're not talking about honeybees. They're talking about flower visitors. I'm going to just say generally. So they're talking about different types of butterflies. They're talking about different types of native bees. So there's a wide range of flower visitors. And so what we did is we actually looked at different types of native flowers and which types of flower visitors these native flowers supported, trying to get an idea of what would be good plants specifically for these flower visitors. Now, when we think about native plants, like native flowers, we're talking small patches. Unless you have a lot of money and a lot of land and you can do some acreage of, say, echinacea, we're talking about an echinacea patch here, an echinacea patch here, which is perfect and will support native bees. And this is kind of who we're targeting with this information, is homeowners, people who love to garden, people who want to see a diversity in their backyard. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a sip. So one thing that Mount Cuba does is they trial different cultivars of plants. And a cultivar is basically a genetic snapshot of a particular genus of or species of flower or plant. And so we looked at particular genera, and then we compared visitation to kind of look and see which particular cultivars attracted which visitors. And we also wanted to look at the relationship of floral traits, because it's not just the fact that providing nectar and pollen. There's also an attraction in terms of flower shape, flower color, the architecture of the plant itself, how tall the plant is, all of these different things. So the first genus that we looked at is the genus Coreopsis. This is also called tick seed, and these are little squares or tiles showing you the morphology of all the different cultivars that we tested. And you can see some of them are yellow and can kind of look similar, but some of them have very thin leaves. Some of them have kind of bigger, broader leaves. Some of these are short bushes. Some of them are tall. Some of them are pink. Some of them have dark centers. Some of them are all yellow, right? So we have a variety of morphologies here. And we also, and we can see that, but what we didn't know per se was differences in pollen as well as differences in nectar amongst these different cultivars. So one thing that we did one year is we decided to vacuum these flowers. So we took this leaf blower, we converted it backwards into a vacuum instead of a blower. And we basically went to this trial garden where Coreopsis was planted, all of these different cultivars, and we vacuumed the Coreopsis. And we did this for multiple days. And we collected about 3,784 visitors off of 19 different types or cultivars of Coreopsis. And what we found is that the main group of bees that utilized Coreopsis were the Hlictids, the sweat bees. And you can see also hoverflies. And so hoverflies or syrphids, this is another type of flower visiting fly that goes to these flowers for nectar as well as for pollen. You can see the family Apidae was also represented here. And then we have very small slices of the pie representing some of these other types of groups from other bees like Hlictids, Andreinids, the mining bees, megachilids. We have a small slice as well. So a lot of different groups. So the idea is here, do cultivars of native plants provide the same ecological benefit for pollinators? Are all cultivars made equal? And these are kind of some preliminary results, because we also wanted to know, okay, if we vacuumed versus just did visual observation, because we didn't want to vacuum and kill off all of these bees. The first year we vacuumed just to get an overall look, and the second year we observed. And what we found is vacuuming, we actually could get different families or different groups of bees better by vacuuming. But by just observing, we observed a lot more bumblebees, a lot more honeybees, as well as some of the leafcutter bees. So some of these larger bees that couldn't be sucked up from the vacuum, or maybe scared off by the sound, were better observed and recorded and reported by observation. So now I'm going to talk to you about some of the differences that we saw in terms of our flower visitors and which different types of cultivars they preferred. And so this is mean bumblebees per flower. And this is on different cultivars of early season Coreopsis. So the C represents Coreopsis, and this second word here represents the specific cultivar that was trialed. And so a lot of these look different, like I showed you that initial picture showing you the different morphologies. And we wanted to see, out of these different Coreopsis cultivars, were certain ones preferred by bumblebees over others. And you can see that Lacy Lingerie, I don't know who picks these names. Maybe it was a pervert. I don't know. Lacy Lingerie, you could see the bumblebees preferred. And also you can see this moonbeam here as well. And so these three, verticulata and Zagreb, which are actually true species or straight species, ones that naturally occur in nature, you can see this group was preferred over all of these other cultivars here. So just interesting to see, yeah, there is some differences between cultivars, and there is some preference going on. This is honeybees, mean honeybee visits per flower. Again, looking at these early season Coreopsis, and you can see honeybees actually preferred not Lacy Lingerie, but Route 66. So again, we're seeing that not all of these cultivars are made equal. And this idea of trying to understand, is there a certain cultivar that we should focus on? There might be something to it. Is this all kind of complete and everybody go out and buy this particular cultivar? No, this is just preliminary, just done one season for us to get an idea is, are there preferences? Now, these are different ones. We have different cultivars of Coreopsis that occur in late season. So these are later season bloomers. And you can see, again, there's preferences for this whole entire redshift, showstopper, C major, and center stage, which is a cultivar group, meaning that they all kind of are more closely related to each other than these other cultivars down here. And so the bumblebees really preferred this cultivar group. All right, yay. So this is mean honeybees per flower, and this is on early season. So these are the same early season cultivars, but now we're seeing that honeybees are preferring Route 66. So this is a different cultivar. And like I said earlier, we are not quite sure necessarily what it is about this cultivar and if this would be repeated another season. But with the choice of all of these different cultivars in bloom, honeybees preferred Route 66. All right, next slide. And so we also looked at late season Coreopsis, and you can see these are completely different cultivars. And what's interesting here is that bumblebees preferred a whole kind of cultivar group, meaning that they all are kind of genetically similar to one another. So they all have redshift, showstopper, C major, and center stage. All are considered a cultivar grouping, and these were preferred by bumblebees. Okay, the next slide. Now moving on to one of my favorite flowers, and this is bee balm in the genus Monarda. And we also looked at trialing different cultivars of Monarda. And I'm sure many of you maybe even have different cultivars planted in your garden. I know I have a couple different ones, actually ones that we're going to talk about too. And so we're going to investigate how flower visitors respond to these different cultivars of Monarda. So you can move on to the next slide. So when we just look at the overall composition of flower visitors, sorry, the formatting got a little weird on there. You can see, unlike the Coreopsis, the primary visitor to Monarda were bumblebees. And we have different types or different slices of the pie too. We have European wool carder bees, which is a type of megachilid. I'll show you a picture of it in a little bit and tell you a story about it. But then we also see Hlictids as well. And then we see smaller pieces of the pie. But this is kind of overall visitation to different Monarda cultivars in 2015. Okay, the next slide. And this, let me just walk you through this slide. On the very bottom, those names, it stands for, the M stands for Monarda for each of those, because these are all Monarda species. But Monarda citriodora is the straight species. So this is one that is just naturally occurring in nature. Monarda citriodora bergamo is a cultivar, so it's been bred from Monarda citriodora. So it has that kind of cultivar name. Another straight species is Monarda digima, and you can see that there's two different cultivars off of Monarda digima. Monarda digima Cambridge Scarlet, and then Monarda digima Jacob Klein. Our third straight species is Monarda fistulosa, and then off of Monarda fistulosa is Monarda fistulosa Claire Grace, and then Monarda fistulosa purple mildew resistant. So you can see these were bred off of that straight species for a particular trait. And so we're looking here at this graph at frequency of flower visitation by bumblebees to these different Monardas, both straight species and the different cultivars bred from them. And you can see that the fistulosa species group and cultivars were preferred compared to these other species of Monarda and cultivars of Monarda. And this is a pretty straightforward graph here. Oh, you can go to the next slide. That we see hummingbirds love Monarda digima Jacob Klein. So again, now we're seeing hummingbirds aren't like bumblebees. They aren't into fistulosa. They like Monarda digima, specifically the cultivar Jacob Klein. So pretty obvious answer there. Next slide. Oh, this is one of my favorites. And you saw on that pie early on that there was a percentage of visitation by sweat bees or Hlictids. These are small little bees. Remember, we talked about them. A lot of these nest in cavities or in the wood specifically. Some of them also can nest in the ground. And what you're seeing in the picture on the left is actually individual flowers of Monarda, and you can see the little anthers on there. And what's interesting is that we saw visitation similar across all straight species as well as the cultivars. So sweat bees liked all of them, but they weren't going for nectar. They were specifically going and collecting pollen off of the anthers. So they were utilizing this flower in a different way. Next slide. And so this is a love story here, and Monarda citriodora. This is the wool carder bee. This is a type of megachilid, and they only used Monarda citriodora. And what's really interesting, it was a male and females, and the males actually would protect the females because the females were utilizing this flower to collect nectar and pollen, and the males were kind of protecting the female, guarding her per se, and also rendezvousing with her, so dating and courting her. So pretty cool usage of this Monarda citriodora as a little love flower. And next slide. And so because this is a PDF, I don't think you'll be able to play the video, but this is a video was embedded into this slide. And I wanted you to see this Carpenter Bee utilizing Monarda. Each one of those beautiful purplish pink things coming out is an individual flower. So it is a composite flower head made up of multiple different flowers. And you can see that each flower, the corolla, is very narrow and skinny at the base. And basically what the video would have showed you is this Carpenter bee, it being a big old bee, drilling a hole into the base of the corolla and therefore kind of foregoing touching any of the reproductive parts of the flower and robbing or nectar thieving. And so it's really interesting. We have video of all of these different types of bees utilizing these flowers, and you can see that different bees, depending on their morphological similarity or match with the flower morphology, behave with the flower in a very unique way. Next slide. So in terms of broader impacts, and this is something that is really important to me, is that we can make informed landscape decisions, and we can understand what our flower visitors need. And a lot of it is going to just be observation. This is not heavy duty science here. Of course, if you have a trial garden, you have different ones and you have different numbers of plants, you can look at it statistically, but just planting different things in your backyard and observing who's using them sometimes is good enough. And we can then decide what we want in our backyard, and we can provide that habitat and those resources. Next slide. So this is a great field guide, and this actually helps you understand and learn the different bees. So this is just a link to a PDF, and it's just a really good guide to starting to learn the different solitary bee species that exist. Next slide. And as we were doing this work, we also just did a lot of observations, and this goes back to our forest bees, trying to understand every flower, everything that was flowering in our forest patches, we looked at, and then we looked to see who was visiting or utilizing the flower. And for osmia, or for the leaf cutters or orchard bees, you can see this is not an exhaustive list. This is just what we saw when we actually did our sampling. They were visiting and utilizing resources from all of these flowers. Next slide. Now, the kleptoparasite, the nomada, you can see here the adults do need to have nectar in order to fly around and kleptoparasitize Andreina nests. So how they got their nectar in order to fuel their flight was by visiting these flowers in these forest patches. Next slide. Now, in these forest patches, we saw Hlictid, specifically in the genus Lasioglossum, visiting these different flowers. And I know this is recorded, and now, Justin, you have a copy of this PDF, so please share with the group so that you can have these lists. I know I'm going through them very quickly, but you guys can spend a little bit more time looking at these slides on your own. Next slide. And this is Serotina. This is the small carpenter bee. This is the genus Serotina, so there's multiple species, but we did see the Serotina utilizing all of these different flowers as well. So you can see there's some goldenrod even on here, and all different types of flowers, from hibiscus to invasives like multiflora rose. Okay. And then bumblebees. We have all of these different, from clovers to invasives like multiflora to different viburnums for the bumblebees. Next slide. And then our Andreina, our little miners. Again, these are going to be more commonly found on flowers that are going to be blooming early. There are some later season Andreina that you will see on like Rudbeckia and maybe some Coreopsis as well. Next slide. And Grace Savoy Burke, she was one of the graduate students who did this work, as well as Owen Cass, who I don't have a picture of, and also David Gardner. So these were the 3 graduate students that contributed to collecting this data and kind of developing these projects out. And next slide.
I don't think there's a slide up yet.
Okay, well then that is it. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Sorry for the technical difficulties.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool.
So Debbie, what's the native habitat for bumblebees? And I have a lot of bumblebees in my backyard. I hear that they are under threat, but you wouldn't know that from my yard where I have a lot of them, sometimes crowding out my own.
Yeah, so there's certain bumblebee species that are super speciose and are definitely not in danger. We used to have a much larger diversity of species in our area, which we no longer have. So there's certain species that are under threat, and there's some that are thriving, as you can see in your backyard. They actually nest in they can nest in grass thickets under the ground. They love old mouse nests. That's a really common place for them to make a nest, is finding an old mouse nest underground. So they're underground, but they like nests that have already been excavated out by something before them.
Thanks.
They like empty nuke equipment too that you haven't touched for a while.
They definitely could move into empty nuke equipment, especially if a mouse was in there before, or even if they just find it suitable. Yes.
Yeah, and they don't like it when the beekeeper goes to get that equipment.
No, it's funny because bumblebees, when they're foraging, are extremely docile, but you would never understand how territorial. Once you come near their nest, they're extremely protective of their nest.
Yes,
so
they are.
Very different attitude when you come near their babies.
Yes, I don't blame them.
Yeah.
I thought that I heard you say fairly early on in our talk that the native bees, the mining bees, will provision a nest with pollen, okay, underground, and lay an egg, and that the larva, after it consumes the pollen and pupates, emerges next season.
Yes.
Did I hear that wrong? So it
No.
actually goes through the winter as a pupa and emerges as an adult the following spring?
Yes. A lot of them actually will go into diapause as a pupa.
Wow.
And different species have different stages that they go into diapause in the winter, but many of them are in the pupa stage. And then when those weather cues and temperatures and degree days are enough to trigger their physiological development, they'll go through that final transition from a pupa to an adult. And that's why, like with alfalfa leafcutter bees, if you think of those, they can actually keep them in cold storage and then move them to an alfalfa field during bloom and trigger their emergence out of diapause.
Wow. What was the term that you used to indicate the period of, I guess, semi-hibernation?
Diapause?
Yeah, what is it again?
It's called diapause.
Diapause.
Yeah, it's DIA and then PAUSE.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Cool.
Great presentation. Thank you so much.
I am wondering, are you seeing, so a lot of the little critters, I think were eating native plants, you said?
Yes.
Is that correct? Okay. So how are you seeing that? Like, so here in Jersey, we have too many deer eating our new growth forests, so they're not replenishing as well because deer like to also eat native plants. Is this affecting, these little cute critters?
Yeah, actually, deer browse is a big problem in terms of destroying habitat for a lot of these forest bees. And there's been concerted efforts in Maryland, specifically more in Maryland, to actually look at the effects of deer browse on native bees. Of course, there's not a whole lot of funding available to do that work. So there's not a whole lot of extensive research, but it definitely affects foraging resources, deer browse. That's a great question.
Thank you. And the follow-up, do you think there'll be, your students will maybe intersect deer out of an area to see what might happen, or that's too far in the future and not even thought about?
Yeah, and so a colleague of mine has done a little bit of work in Maryland, doing specifically that, kind of creating areas where deer are excluded and looking at differences in forest bees and in terms of foraging. And the problem there is just the size that you have to exclude and how well you are actually truly excluding the deer is difficult. And also the foraging range for some of these bees and the timing. So there's a lot of different variables, but I know that they've been trying to answer some of those questions in Maryland. I'm not sure where they're at with that research, though.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Debbie, we're all good here.
All right. Well, have a wonderful evening, and maybe I'll see some of you in Massachusetts.
Thank you, you too.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.